It's Alabama Annie, bringing you part two of one of my books available on Kindle entitled The Starlight Tavern. I come to Starlight. When I was a little girl, Mama and I lived in a neighborhood near the furnaces and the mill in Birmingham, Alabama, in a row house that she and my papa had purchased when they were first married. It wasn't a big house or a fancy one. It wasn't in a fancy neighborhood. All of the houses in the neighborhood were built along the same plan with a front porch, a living room and kitchen, and two small bedrooms and a bath. They were called shotgun houses because you could see straight through to the back porch from the front door. Each little house had a small back porch, and the backyards of these houses adjoined block after block. Most of them had picket fences with a gate that sometimes opened to the back alley where they delivered coal and ice and milk or firewood. All the houses were close together, only a few feet apart, so that you could smell what your neighbor was cooking most evenings and even hear what they were listening to on the radio. And in summer, most of the kitchen doors were open all day long if you were a kid. All of us had free reign in the neighborhood. White kids and black kids ate cookies and milk or sandwiches just together at each other's table in those kitchens, and our parents were all friends. Most of the men worked together at the mill, and people helped one another out. They helped in hard times and rejoiced when things were good. When my papa got killed in an accident at the mill, all the neighbors came to bring food or lend a hand and do what they could to help and comfort us. That's just the way things were, despite the things we heard sometimes about some of us being better than others because of the color of our skin. To me and Mama and the people in our neighborhood, we were all family. I awoke the Sunday morning my mama died, expecting to find her in the warm kitchen cooking our Sunday breakfast on the wood stove. But instead I found that she was still in bed with me. She was laying on her side facing the wall where a picture of Jesus and some angels hung. I called to her, but she didn't answer, and then I noticed how cold she was when I touched her. "Mama, are you cold?" I asked, pulling the quilt closer around her, but she didn't move, she didn't make a sound, and she didn't open her eyes. "Mama, wake up," I cried as I leaned over her, shaking her by the shoulder. That's when her hand fell out from underneath the covers, and I knew something was terribly wrong. I got off the bed and ran for the neighbors in my gown and with no slippers on. I burst through the kitchen door at Miss Martha's, startling her as she turned from the stove, telling her that something was wrong with Mama. Miss Martha asked where Mama was, and then sat me down in a chair at the table and told me to wait while she went to check on her, and in a few moments she returned with her handkerchief in her hand, and she was crying. She told me to wait where I was and went into the next room, and I could hear her dialing the telephone and talking to someone. And when she returned, she sat down in the chair beside me and took my hands in hers. I looked at her and asked if Mama was all right. She told me that my Mama was dead. "She's gone to Jesus, baby," Miss Martha whispered as she pulled me close and asked if there was anyone she could call, some relative. But I didn't know what to tell her at first until I thought of Aunt Mary, and I told her that I knew Mama kept her telephone number in the bedside table. She brought me a cup of warm coffee with lots of cream and sugar the way I liked it, and said for me to wait there again while she went to find my aunt's telephone number. After she returned, soon a policeman and an ambulance driver arrived, and they came inside our house and covered Mama in a white sheet and took her from our house on a stretcher in an ambulance. They drove away. Then our friends came through Miss Martha's back door bringing food and tried to comfort me, but I was so sad I barely could eat anything. Someone had gone over to our house and brought some of my clothes and toys, and Miss Martha told me I'd be staying with her until she could reach my aunt, and that was just fine with me. I barely could recall my Aunt Mary. She had come to visit us when Daddy had been killed in the accident at the mill, and I recalled that even though she and Mama were sisters, they were nothing alike, and I hadn't liked her very much. Mama had never minced words about her. I don't think she liked her at all. She called her a floozy and said that she was selfish. But we had no other family. I knew Mama and I had visited a lot of graves to put flowers on them on decoration days and other such occasions, and when we'd gone to the cemetery, she'd pointed out my grandparents, some aunts and uncles, and a couple of cousins of mine who'd been killed in the war, and though Mama had said those things about Aunt Mary and didn't seem to like her very much, she had always told me that if anything should ever happen to her, Aunt Mary would be the one to take care of me. The thought of leaving my home and friends and going to live with her in that creepy old tavern of hers frightened me. And one time when we had gone to visit Aunt Mary in Starlight at the tavern, I'd asked Mama if that was where she and my aunt had grown up. She said, "Goodness, no." Mama told me about their childhood growing up on a small farm near Gunnersville, Alabama, on the Tennessee River with her mother and father and her brother James, who had drowned in the river when he fell out of a boat. Mary was the baby of the family and younger than Mama by 3 years, and she said their Mama had spoiled her to no end. She told me that all Aunt Mary had to do was to cry, and my grandparents would give her anything she asked for until times got hard and they could barely afford to buy shoes to wear to school. But she told me that both she and Aunt Mary did graduate, but that shortly after that their papa had died suddenly, and their Mama had to sell the farm and move them all in with her mother. She said that Mary and she both got jobs in a cotton mill and worked there for a time. Then Mama said she and Mary went to dance one night, and Mama met Edgar Lee, my papa, and they got married, and she moved to Birmingham with him, and Aunt Mary went to work with a friend of hers in a cotton mill in Fort Payne, Alabama, and that's where she met her future husband, Robert Malone. Robert was older than Mary by 10 or 12 years, Mama said, and she and Papa hadn't liked Robert very much at all when they'd first met. She said they'd taken the train from Birmingham north to Sequoia to visit Robert and Mary, and they had met them at the station and drove them up the big mountain in Robert's car to the tavern. She said they had their wedding on the lawn, and there was a big barbecue and dance that weekend in honor of the new couple. But Mama got mad at Papa because he drank moonshine and got all soused up, as she said, and said Aunt Mary and Uncle Robert were a bad influence on him. I think Mama hated alcohol. I was only around Uncle Robert 3 times in my life, and the first time was when Papa got killed at the mill, and they came when he died to attend his funeral and visit for a couple days after. The other 2 times, he and Aunt Mary were coming from or going to the beach or somewhere and stopped in at our house for a short visit. I could tell Mama didn't like him, but he seemed awfully nice to me. He was a tall, slim man with a mustache and short brown hair, and he smoked a pipe like Papa had, and he always smelled of tobacco. I loved that smell. He took me for ice cream one afternoon and helped me bring in firewood for the wood stove, and took her shopping for groceries, and he gave Mama a $100 bill to help us out as they were leaving after Papa's funeral. The other 2 visits, he brought me some seashells from Florida and a set of Lincoln logs, and he sat on the porch floor with me one afternoon while we built with them. Mama and I had visited Aunt Mary once at the tavern when I was 5. I remember we had taken the train from the station in town and rode north for what seemed like hours to arrive at the foot of Lookout Mountain in the little town of Sequoia in time to attend Uncle Robert's funeral after Aunt Mary had called to say he had passed away. My Uncle Robert had died suddenly that spring just before Easter, and Mr. Harvey arrived at the depot in that big black car of his to pick us up and drove us up the mountain to the tavern. When we arrived at the tavern, I saw there were all kinds of people there on the big front porch and in the kitchen and the parlor and the dining room, and there were more cakes and pies than I had ever seen in my life. And a lady named Miss Hattie greeted us at the front door as Mr. Harvey hauled in my mother's bag from the car and led us down the hallway from the parlor to our room. After a few moments, Miss Hattie returned and we followed her through the parlor again into the dining room and the kitchen through another door that led to a narrow hallway. She knocked and we waited. Then Aunt Mary said to come inside, and Mama took my hand and led me into her room. She was sitting in a chair in her room with the curtains drawn in her bathrobe when we stepped in. She stood up from the chair at her dressing table and hugged Mama, clinging to her for a moment, and began to sob as Mama tried to comfort her. When Aunt Mary calmed down a bit, she turned to me, and then she let go of Mama and dabbed at her eyes and pulled me to her. "I am so glad you came," she said as she kissed me on my cheek, and I noticed how funny she smelled. The odor was similar to that of cedar, but sweeter. I had never seen her without makeup on before, and I noticed how pale she was, and there were red rings around her eyes, and I could tell she'd been crying for a while. I recalled how Mama had cried when Papa got killed at the mill. She said she hadn't slept, and Mama told her we'd let her get some rest, and we left Aunt Mary alone. Mama told me that she was grieving, and she barely left her room until the next day when it was time to go to the funeral. I liked the room Mama and I had shared in the big old rambling tavern, but from the moment we arrived and I'd first stepped inside, I hadn't liked the tavern too much. I went rambling around while Mama was visiting with the grown-ups in the dining room that afternoon, and I noticed the rooms were dark and cold, and it seemed like very little sunlight came through the big windows, even though it was almost summertime. That night, I told Mama I thought the place was creepy, like old Miss Paget's house in our neighborhood. The Paget house sat directly across from my school at the end of the block. It had big, empty windows, and it stood without a family in it for a long time. The windows were broken and the paint was peeling, and every time I passed that house, I swear I thought I saw someone watching me through an upstairs window of the place. I'd told Mama that, but she said it was only my imagination. "That old house has been empty for years, baby," she'd say. At any rate, I didn't stray too far from her during our visit to the tavern. I sat with the grown-ups in the parlor and had cake and ice cream in the big kitchen with Miss Hattie. The day of the funeral, I stood with Mama and Aunt Mary at Uncle Robert's funeral and played outside later with another little girl who was visiting with her parents. She had 2 dolls, and we played with them on a quilt under the big oak tree. Hope you'll join me for episode 3.